Okay, welcome back. So let's move forward. We're going to leave the 17th century and the Baroque, and we're going to move into the 18th century, especially the latter part of the 18th century, to talk about the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, and the Age of Revolution. So in some sense, we're leaving the Christian worldview to a certain degree behind, or at least the beginnings of it, with the arrival of the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. And we're going to see, hopefully I'm going to convey it to you well enough, that the Enlightenment, this Age of Reason, that truth be told begins in the 17th century, will germinate and become ideas that are revolutionary. So that's the topography, the roadmap for this next half hour, 40 minutes or so. So I warn you, I got a little GIF happy with this lecture. When we talk about the Enlightenment, we're talking about, roughly speaking, the 1715 to 1789. And 1789, there's no coincidence there that's the beginnings of the French Revolution, which is where we end today. So the Enlightenment is a huge, huge topic. The Enlightenment, we could have a whole semester just on the Enlightenment itself. When we're talking about writers, when we're talking about philosophers, when we're talking about politicians, when we're talking about artists, there's just a whole slew of important characters in this history of Western Enlightenment. And so to make it bite-sized enough for you, I brought in four key themes of the Enlightenment that we're going to trace, that we're going to go through. I'm going to give you some examples so that these become very clear for you. At least that's my hope. So we're going to discuss together four different threads that are crucial to what the Enlightenment was, or maybe hopefully still is. One, it's the advent of modern science, techniques of modern science, and the modern scientific method. This is incredibly important. Two, we see new theories of human nature. Equally important. So we'll talk about that. Three, one of the key relationships between the Enlightenment and world history is a questioning of religion. A questioning, first and foremost, the divine right of religious rule that, in a monarchy is usually, or has been usually, ordained by a god, by a deity, and in some instances even a questioning of the existence of God at all, that there even is a deity. And then number four, and this is the most general understanding of the Enlightenment, and I think the one that's maybe the most useful for us. This is still very much a necessary mode of operating in the world, especially since we live in a sea now of information and misinformation. The practice of critiquing everything, of being skeptical, of questioning, of trying to see how things really work, of trying to peel back the layers of maybe the more superficial aspects of existence. This is all also part of the Enlightenment. So these four things we're going to talk about and go through, and then you'll have a pretty good leg up, basic understanding of what the Enlightenment was. So we start with modern science. We start with the modern scientific method, which, if you think about it, it's incredibly important for a number of different reasons. Here's a painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, an English painter, from 1768, and it's called An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump. It's an oil on canvas. And I guess what's amazing about this painting right off the bat is this is the first painting I show you that shows you a scientific experiment that has nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with mythology, nothing to do with any iconography that we've been dealing with all semester long throughout the history of art. It's a completely secular image. And so what you have, and this would happen, there would be scientists that go around, philosophers and scientists, let's say, were not yet separate. Philosophers sort of did everything. It would go around and perform these experiments. these scientific experiments, which by 1768 was more like a parlor trick. It wasn't really advanced science. The air pump is something that's devised by a guy named Boyle a century before this, which is really important for the formation of modern science, the formation of modern physics. And so here we have a philosopher, probably at a wealthy person's home, doing this experiment in front of young people who are learning, an assistant who's sort of helping the philosopher, and then of course these young kids, the young girls who are looking away in dismay. And what are they looking away from in dismay? This bird that's inside this air pump that's fighting for its life, that doesn't have any air and can't breathe anymore. And this young man is about to, and it's dark on this side, but he has a bird cage, so the bird cage either just came out of that or he's about to put the bird back into it. So the crux of this experiment, which was something that scientists debated, was whether or not vacuums could exist, whether or not there could be a space that had no oxygen, that had no air. And this was debated. And so before this experiment was devised by Boyle, there were really only two options for answering this question. If someone asked you, do vacuums exist in reality? You could either use Aristotelian reasoning and try to deduce whether or not a vacuum exists. So you never see one, you don't do an experiment to test whether one can happen or not. You use deductive reasoning. Or you say, no, God would never allow, this is God's creation, so there are no empty spaces, like there's no way that there's a vacuum. So you either do an argument based on ancient logic, especially Aristotelian deduction, or you would take recourse to a divine argument, basically saying, let's say the Christian God would not allow vacuums to exist. All of a sudden now, when we have people like Boyle, when we have people like Newton, when we have people like Galileo who are kicking about during these centuries, when all of a sudden they come up with instruments where they can test reality, where they can come up with experiments with a hypothesis of what will happen, and then not like guess or deduce what will happen, but actually perform the experiment to see what happens one way or the other, then you have something very different. Then you don't have truth coming from human reasoning or truth coming from this divine God, but truth is coming from the world itself that you're seeing unfold within an experiment. So I hope you can appreciate how radical that is and how important that is, because that gets human bias, human thinking, either on the divine or on human abilities to think. It sort of brings it out of the equation and it lets reality decide. So in this case, we know for sure the bird can't breathe anymore, that yes, a vacuum can exist, and we can see it for our eyes through this experiment, through this proxy of an animal body. So this painting shows you, seems kind of, at first it seems really not that consequential. It looks like, like a magician doing a parlor trick or something like that. And that is not a big, I've had students say this looks like a big tequila glass or something like that. But it's not. It's like some specimen. So it's another scientific object. It doesn't really seem that consequential. But when you think about it in the history of modern science and the modern scientific method, which is how hopefully we're going to end up with a vaccine in like a year and a half or something like that, right? Super, super consequential as far as an idea, and definitely part of the Enlightenment, and getting either human biases or divine biases, religious biases, out of the knowledge of the natural world, out of the knowledge of science. So, very, very important idea, and an interesting painting to illustrate that idea. So, like I said, the second part is of the Enlightenment is also this idea that human nature has started to change, the conception of what it means to be human. So you have these really beautiful genre scenes by Chardin, French painter Jean-Simeon Chardin. This is the governess, and they look like these like lovely bourgeois homes, or homes of noble, probably more nobility. So this young boy who's about to be taught something, about to have a lesson with his governess, right? So this is just like, and a tennis racket and all the stuff that you might imagine a young boy would have at the time. And so again, this also seems humble and not so revolutionary, but there are a couple things to keep in mind here when it comes to the idea of human nature and the Enlightenment. One is that before this period, there was no conception of what it meant to be a child. There was no conception of what it meant to be a child that sort of, I know it sounds strange, but goes through a process of education and forms and is formed. Really, before this, children were kind of deemed to be adults that just have to grow up. But the idea of like child psychology is something that begins in the Enlightenment during this period, especially with someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher who even writes a book called Émile, which is all about education, which is all about how do you educate a young person. So today that doesn't seem so revolutionary, but it certainly was back then. Even more consequential about the changes in the conception of human nature at that time was also getting away from an idea which would be very much part of a Christian worldview in Europe, that you're born into original sin. That everyone is not born neutral, that they're born into original sin, and then they're burdened with all these ideas, right? They're burdened with all this content that's already inside of them. You had someone like John Locke, very, very important political philosopher, who would who's writing about human nature at this time and arguing against that, arguing against the fact that, let's say, we come with ready-made ideas, that we come with baggage, that we come with original sin. He has a very famous theory of human nature that we're actually born as clean slates, as tabula rasa. If you've studied Locke, if you've read about his philosophy, the idea that no, we're born neutral, we're born blank, which means that we take on ideas. They're not ready-made inside us as if we're pre-manufactured. No, these things that are ideas that we take on as we go forward. We take on original sin. We take on our education. We take on society. We take on the world as a place that is experienced. And so this might also not sound so radical, but think about it. If all of a sudden we don't come with ingrained ideas or morals or sinfulness, then all of a sudden all the stuff we do take on becomes more changeable, because you can't change original sin if you believe in it. I mean, you'd then be arguing with God. But if you argue that we're born as a blank slate and that everything we experience in the world comes from outside us, comes from society, from culture, so on and so forth, all of a sudden now that can be in some ways changed or challenged. So very revolutionary ideas coming from Locke in this period. You also have this moment with Diderot. Diderot, he writes, not alone, but he's the one who organizes basically the first encyclopedia. So think of it, all of you probably grew up with Wikipedia, but before this there were things called encyclopedias. And so this idea of gathering up all knowledge so that young people or anybody can learn about the latest knowledge, that is a paradigm, that is an idea that comes straight out of the Enlightenment too. So Diderot, there was really an idea that at some point we could just learn everything, and it could all just be in a set of books, and there we go. We have all knowledge, right? That's turned out not to be the case, but it is an interesting and maybe an enviable task or paradigm. So that's Diderot. So all this has to do with this newfound emphasis on knowledge, on education, and on formation in the Enlightenment. On the other side of this, and Diderot, there are entries in the encyclopedia about this, is for Westerners the traumatic experience of meeting and seeing non-Western peoples. So again, this is the age of exploration. This is the age where Western explorers are finally starting to see the rest of the planet, start to see the rest of the globe. And what happens is that they start to meet people who are radically different from a white Christian European. And then, of course, this becomes a big challenge for the worldview of an enlightened white Western European, because whereas before they thought, oh, we're the center of creation, we're the children of God, and we're progressing in history and what have you, right? All of a sudden now they meet other human beings that have nothing to do with their God, have nothing to do with their civilization, and have nothing to do with white Western Christianity. That in some ways is a blow to the conception. Like, why would the Christian God create a world where there are these people that never get discovered until much later, and they're completely different, and they even worship different gods, right? Why would that be? So it challenges the worldview at the time, not only at the level of human nature, because there are some really incredible prints and drawings of largely fabricated fears about these non-Western peoples living, let's say, in modern-day Brazil and Latin America, fears of cannibals. There's a big fear of cannibalism during the Enlightenment, of explorers meeting tribes that practice cannibalism, which is actually true, though if you study cannibalism, you know it's not simply this crazy barbecue where you have human beings on spits, like you're seeing in this print. It's actually a ritualistic practice that it was actually practiced by a number of people in the past, and still in pockets of the world today, believe it or not. But you'd have to go off and study the history of cannibalism, which I've done. It's actually quite fascinating. I bring it up only to say that this is quite a challenge, not only to the conception of the world as somehow divinely ordained and divinely fabricated and made, but also a challenge to human nature, right? How is it that there are these humans that are so different from us, and yet they're human, right? So the very conception of human nature is starting to change during this period of the Enlightenment and is being challenged. There are a couple disasters, a couple catastrophes that happen that also challenge people's faith. This is now, we're moving from the development of modern science to the change of human nature, the conception of human nature. Now we're moving to that third category, which is making people start to doubt about deity, about God, about goodness, about good and evil, and about religion as a whole. And so there are a couple, there are a number of, but I think these are the two biggest ones. One is the 30 Years' War that happens from 1618 to 1648 and the aftermath. It's a horrible, horrible war. So many people killed. And so there's a questioning. There's a questioning that happens after this war about why in the world, if this world is in some ways protected over or resided by a benevolent deity, a god, why would that god let this happen? Why would a god let war and misery and so much death happen under his watch? An even more consequential event, which is really the consequential event for the Enlightenment when it comes to questioning the existence of God as a father figure up in the sky who's watching over us and protecting us, was this horrible earthquake that happened in 1755 in Lisbon. This is a print that shows you Lisbon. So what happened is there was a terrible earthquake that happened right off the coast. Lisbon is in Portugal today, but this is the Iberian Peninsula. And then it triggered a tsunami that completely devastated Lisbon. Killed scores and scores of people, basically destroyed the whole city. And so you had people like Voltaire, like Rousseau, these thinkers around this time who were debating, and of course just normal everyday people asking themselves, wait a second, why in the world would this happen if there's a benevolent God up in the sky who created us and who created the world? Why would he create the world in order just to destroy it and cause us all this misery, suffering, and death, right? There are some people in the 20th century after the Holocaust who asked themselves, how in the world can anyone believe in God when 6 million people were liquidated and exterminated? How could that be something that could happen under the watch of a benevolent deity. So there are two things that happen here in the Enlightenment. One, you will have the beginnings of atheism. You'll have the beginnings of, okay, well, this more or less disproves the fact that there's somehow a God in charge of all this. Or you will have people who become deists. And a deist will believe that, yes, there was a creator, there was a God who got things going. Like he basically set the watch in motion. But after that, it's totally hands off. After that, it's just, it's the creator, but he's hands off. That's more or less being a deist. And a lot of the philosophers in the Enlightenment were deists in this sense. And they understood that being a deist, and certainly being an atheist, would be dangerous, only in the sense that they'd say that without these ideas, without these ideas of a God that gives us an idea of good and evil, that gives us an idea of morality, or that sort of thing, that society wouldn't function. They would be uneasy about this, and so deists would say, yes, maybe there was a God that started it, but it's just, you just got it going. But for just like normal everyday people, it's okay for religion to give them morality and so on and so forth. So these are some of the debates that are happening around religion at this time, and I think you can tell it's quite different from the thoroughly Christian worldview that we've been dealing with since the Middle Ages up through the Renaissance and even the Baroque. And then the last thing, before we get to our examples, because of course we want to talk about art, is the practice of enlightenment as critiquing everything, as being vigilant, and as always questioning dogma, those things that are just beliefs that people hold that are really unprovable, unfounded, or that they simply just take on because of habit. The person who's enlightened, the Enlightenment principle at its core, at bottom, is to critique all beliefs. So why do I believe in a God? Why do I think the things I think? Why do I do the things I do? Why do I eat the things I eat? Why do I read the things I read? All these things are, if you take on an Enlightenment procedure, you'll ask yourself, okay, well, a lot of this is just, I've sort of taken it on, maybe from my parents, maybe from society. This is just out of habit. I've just been doing it, sleepwalking. It's about time I start questioning why I'm doing these things, right? When you get to that moment, then you're thinking like an enlightener. Then you're thinking like someone who will critique everything in order to find, hopefully, a truth that stands the test of this critique, that holds up to it, right? So the great thinker for this is Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, who in 1784 wrote a little text called What is Enlightenment, and I highly, highly, highly recommend you reading this. It's very short. At some point in your life, please read What is Enlightenment. It's very, very important. And the crux of this essay by Kant, he basically says right at the beginning, this is the beginning of the essay, he defines what enlightenment is for him, and it's a very good definition. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. So he's basically saying there, to become mature, one has to step outside of one's immaturity if all they've ever believed or done is because they've been guided by someone else, or they've been told that's what you should do, or that's what you should think. Then he goes a little further. He says, this immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in a lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. This is an interesting step, because what he's saying here is that it's not only that people are living in a state of ignorance is bliss, or that they lack the understanding, but he goes even further. He says that actually some people keep themselves at this immature, self-imposed immature state, not because they're ignorant, but because they lack the resolve or courage to do it any other way. And so this is the motto that he comes up with: saper aude, dare to know, have courage to use your own understanding. He says that is the motto of enlightenment. And so I think you can see how this type of thinking will then lead to radical critique of everything. A critique of God, a critique of society, a critique of human nature, a critique of scientific knowledge, right? Everything that we've talked about so far in the second half of class can be boiled down to Kant's motto of having the courage to use your own understanding, whether it's to come up with a scientific truth, whether it's to understand a new conception of human nature, whether it's to critique religious dogma. All of this at base is having the courage to use your own understanding. And all these ideas, from Locke to Kant, Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau, all of these thinkers, these French Enlightenment thinkers and German Enlightenment thinkers, informed this incredible moment in human history of revolutions. So, of course, the revolution in this country, 1776, the revolution in France in 1789, and then less well known, just the year after the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. It's an amazing moment because the Haitians see their colonizers, who are the French, having overthrown their king, their ruler, and they say, hey, why can't we do that? And which is what they begin to undertake. And you have the beginnings of the Haitian Revolution. So all this is happening right towards the end of the 18th century. And it's not a coincidence. If all these Enlightenment ideas are about critiquing, about questioning, then it makes sense that you'd have people who are politically active who would say, hey, why is it that we have this king? Why is it that we have to be poor? Why is it that we can't make the decisions of how we want our country to be, our state? Why is the king divinely ordained? And who is this God and divine ordiner anyways? You see how all these ideas of the Enlightenment fed into and fomented these important political revolutions that happened in the latter part of the 18th century. And so we're going to finish the class by talking about one in specific because it really contains one of the most important artists of the time, Jacques-Louis David, and that's the French Revolution. So if you've studied this history, you know that the French Revolution kicks off largely because of famine, and there's a symbolic beginning of it, which is the storming of the Bastille, which was this notorious prison in 1789. The prison that would then, all the convicts would be released, and then the former rulers of the country would be held in there, and then guillotined in public executions. Once we get to Retribution and the Reign of Terror, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the artist that's most associated with the French Revolution and these revolutionary ideas is Jacques-Louis David. And in art, this is the period of NeoClassicism. So this means neo is a new, and this is a new form of classicism. So it's not the Renaissance 2.0. David didn't think of himself as just extending the Renaissance in the way that people in the Renaissance thought they were simply extending the ancient world. He knew he was in a different moment. And he's using classical ideas and classical visual cues not to just simply continue that tradition, but to actually update it with ideas from the French Revolution and from this more modern period that he was living. So this is a very famous painting, the Oath of the Horatii, that shows this. This is a scene from Roman history, but it is not about Roman history. It's an allegory about the French Revolution. So you have the father in the center. He's got these three swords. He's inside this home, which is this very austere, pretty cold Roman sort of palace. And you have these three brothers. These are the Horatii. These are the Horatii brothers. This is the whole Horatii family. So you have these very macho, virile, very like gung-ho sons here, pledging to the father and ultimately pledging to the city of Rome that they're going to go fight and they're going to go defend the honor of Rome. On the other side, you have sisters and mother who, of course, well, maybe not of course, the way this is coded, this painting is coded, tells you a lot about gender and the way it was understood, maybe still so today, that men are active and strong and bellicose, like they're war making, and women are weak and they're emotional and they're crying, and maybe they don't understand what needs to be done, right? So that seems to be a vibe coming from this scene. And so it would be one thing just to say that's it, but there's a further complication here. This painting is actually something of a political opera. So you have to understand that there's another family in another state, another city-state, that are called the Curati. And you got to imagine they're doing the same thing because they're about to fight these people. They're about to fight the Horati. These are two city-states that are about to clash. And so you got to imagine they're also pledging an oath to their father. And you also have to know that one of these brothers is engaged to one of the sisters of that other family. And that one of the sisters of the Horati is married to one of the brothers in that other city. So this is like Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, the Montagues and the Capulets. This is a clash between love, in this case family love, and domesticity and comforts of the home, and politics and war, and clash between cities. And so, broadly speaking, this painting thematizes the tension between being faithful to your state, to your government, to your politics, or being faithful to your family, to your private life, to domestic space. And in a moment of revolution, you have to choose. Revolutions don't happen without some kind of sacrifice. And often in history, the sacrifices are bloody and dire and consequential. And so in the Oath of the Horati, it's very clear which side is winning out. It's very clear that it's the gung-ho boys on the left that are about to go to war, that are about to defend the ideals of the Roman Republic. It's clear that they're depicted to be stronger. That's the idea. That's winning out. And so ultimately, this is not about the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic. This is about the very idea of revolution and standing up for and going out to fight for the idea of a republic, which, think about it, is exactly what the French people were doing, at least the revolutionaries were doing, in 1785. And everyone would have known. So this is called an allegory, when you use an older story and you update it for more current events. So this is an allegory for the French Revolution. As was the Death of Socrates. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we talked about it in the first day of class, but the Death of Socrates is also by David, and it's also an allegory for the French Revolution and for the idea of sacrificing, even to the point of death, in the case of Socrates, for your ideals. Okay, so this would also be about fervency and sticking to revolutionary ideas. Again, this is less to do with Athens and Greece in the 5th century. It's much more a parable or an allegory for the French Revolution itself. And so what happens? I'm going to skip this for time because I feel like I've already gone a little too far with some of this material. So I'm just going to move forward to the tennis court oath, which happens in 1789. It's an amazing moment. So you have these paintings that are part of the public discourse. They're all just before the French Revolution, right? And very quickly I show this. You have salons where people would go and look at paintings. So back then, instead of talking about Tiger King or whatever show everybody else is watching and talking about that with friends, people would go see paintings and then talk about the paintings, which we can still do today. There's no problem. You can look at paintings and watch Netflix all at once. So you have this moment, and then the revolution comes. And there's this famous scene that happens at Versailles, which is the court of the French king at the time, of Louis XVI. Everybody gets together, the bourgeoisie, the working class, the clergy, everybody that's part of the revolution, and they're all trying to come up with a constitution. At this point, it would still be a constitutional monarchy. So the people would have a certain amount of say as to what the country would do. So in some sense, the revolution has been successful. Jacques-Louis David is then commissioned to do a painting of this scene. There were so many people that the only place at the French court in Versailles, where they could hold this huge meeting, this huge assembly, was in the indoor tennis court. So this is that indoor tennis court, and this is a depiction of all the people that were there who are jostling for power, jostling for what the country is going to look like post-absolute monarchy into a representative monarchy. And so this is amazing because Jacques-Louis David is commissioned to do this very, very large painting, immortalizing this moment, but ultimately it was the only stage it ever got to was this drawing and this unfinished section. So you can see David it's very interesting because here you see an artist working. The people that are that are gonna be painted, he draws them initially completely naked. As if that when he does he paint them, it's as if the clothes are going on top of the actual human form, which is a really interesting sort of look into how the artist worked. But ultimately, he only ever got as far as painting a few hands and a face. And you might ask, why is it unfinished? Why would he not be able to finish this work? It's a bit dark. What you have rather quickly after the French Revolution, or as part of the French Revolution, these next 3 or 4 years, is that a number of these people who were part of the revolution initially get killed. There's a lot of internal fighting with the French Revolution. You have the head of the French Revolution, Robespierre, who's the head of the Jacobins, fighting with other revolutionary groups, notably the Girondins, and a lot of political executions. So basically, he couldn't finish this painting because a lot of these people that he would have immortalized were no longer revolutionaries. They had actually been guillotined. They're actually now out of the picture. So that's the reason for this, and it gets us to the Reign of Terror. Unfortunately, in history, especially violent revolutions, there's some really amazing revolutions that happen in the 20th century. What they call velvet revolutions, revolutions that happen without much violence. But that's a rarity in history. Most revolutions that have happened, there's bloodshed and there's violence, and things can go quite wrong. There's a wonderful quote by Walter Benjamin. He says, "Every fascism results from a failed revolution." Every form of fascism in history has been the result of a failed revolution, which is very interesting, and he might be right in some ways. And he certainly is here, in the sense that these ideals of the French Revolution, which were so promising, people controlling their own fates, turned into something of almost a civil war and a reign of terror, where Robespierre and the Jacobins started killing everybody, even people within their own circle. So this moment of violence and paranoia and jostling for power. And again, sorry, I got GIF happy in this class. And so this is where you have these very famous scenes of revolutionaries being guillotined during the reign of terror. And this was still a moment where executions were very public. They were they definitely were spectacles that people would get excited for, and they would come to watch, like people go to see a sporting event or something like that today. And so David continues to be the major painter here, even during the Reign of Terror, because he's in fact one of the higher level Jacobins. He's more or less the minister of propaganda. He's responsible for making posters and floats and all sorts of stuff for the Jacobins, for the revolutionaries during the Reign of Terror. And maybe his most important painting that comes from the Reign of Terror is the Death of Marat. So this was a friend of his, and someone working just under Robespierre, a really high-level Jacobin, who he's in his bath, and you might think this is such a weird place to do a portrait, especially a death portrait of a figure. Like, why would David do that? Well, that's explained away by the fact that Marat had a really horrible skin condition. And he basically had to be in a medicinal bath most of the time in order to do his work. Otherwise, it would be too painful. So he's in his medicinal bath. And he's just been assassinated. A woman who is a Girondin, her name was Charlotte Corday, finagles her way into his workspace. So you can tell, here's the ink, here's here's a letter, and this is Charlotte Corday's letter. So she has a letter that supposedly has names of people she's informing on. So this would be a list that Marat would be happy to receive, because then he would kill, he would execute or get rid of people who are betraying the cause of the Jacobins, of the revolution. But she actually turns out to be a counter-revolutionary, or a Girondin, and once she gives him the letter, she stabs him and then runs off. She's caught and then executed, but there's her knife on the ground, and David has given you the puncture wound, and of course the medicinal bath is kind of filling up with blood. And so it's a pretty radical painting, because it looks like a history painting. I'm going to show you here in a second. It looks actually a lot like Michelangelo's Pietà. This is one of the most beautiful statues you could hope to see in person. It's in St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. We didn't have time to talk about this during the High Renaissance, but here it is. Very famous Pietà, which means this grieving statue of Mary with Christ folded on her body. And you can tell that David has echoed visually Christ in Marat. And so this is incredible, because this means that we have two martyrs here, but one is a martyr for his faith, or his God, or is God for Christians, and the other this is completely secular. He's a martyr for a political cause, for a political revolution. And so this makes this an ultra-modern painting. This is a painting that's securely within modernity. And there are a couple other nice little details here. The note has been changed. David has changed the note so that it says Charlotte Corday, but it says nothing about political prisoners. It says nothing about informants. So David has changed that. And a lot of people say, he's made Marat look better. Because, of course, if you see Marat with his informant list, the first thing you think of is, oh, wow, he's going to go, like, take these people out, right? But if David changes the letter and it says, it's just like a general letter introducing herself, then Marat looks good. David also added this letter that you're made to believe that Marat was working on this as he was being interrupted. There's money, and it's a letter to the family of a soldier that was killed, the family of a revolutionary. So one more moment here on his workstation, on his little wooden workbench, that makes Marat look good, makes Marat look like a noble political leader. So not only Christ-like, not only this important martyr for the French Revolution, at least for the Jacobins, but there are also little details that make Marat look like a good leader, right? So there is an uneasiness here where you get the sense that David, this is a bit like propaganda, right? Slightly tweaking the facts and giving us a form of propaganda. But nonetheless, an incredible painting, and defiantly modern in the sense that it's completely current and completely secular and political. And so that is the end of NeoClassicism and the Enlightenment, which we did very quickly. That is a lot of ideas. So, like I tell you on the website, if there's no response for this week, I hope you still watch these lectures. Hopefully they'll help you with the final exam. And I mean, really, all I care about is that you find them interesting and compelling. And that's that. Your attendance will then be your papers, your formal analysis papers, which you can turn in today. But like I say on the website, more or less completely flexible this semester. So if you want to take the weekend, if you need a little bit of extra time, don't sweat it. That's completely fine with me. Stay well, everybody.